Hi, I'm Adi Pordila, and in this course you'll learn JavaScript from a web designer's point of view. We'll start with the basics like variables, data types, and loops, and we'll finish with more complex notions like functions, selectors, and events. In the end, we'll have a look at 5 common coding patterns using JavaScript. With that said, welcome to JavaScript for web designers. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to the first lesson of this course, where you'll learn 2 things: what is JavaScript and how to work with it. Let's begin. JavaScript is a programming language, and if you ever took a computer science class in high school or in college maybe, you might have learned Pascal or C or C++. Well, those are also programming languages. PHP is also a programming language. Now, JavaScript can run locally in your browser, and that's usually what it does, but it can also run on a server using Node.js. Regardless of how you run it, JavaScript is one of the 3 core technologies used to produce content for the World Wide Web, the other 2 being, of course, HTML and CSS. Now, every modern browser supports JavaScript. By default, you don't need any plugins to run it. So that makes it a really good choice for adding a little bit of interactivity to your website or your web application. And that's a very quick intro to JavaScript. Now, how exactly do you run it? When it comes to writing and running JavaScript code, you can do it in 3 different ways. The first way is in the browser console. So I have Firefox here opened, and this right here is the console. And for example, I can type stuff like alert. I can specify a message and hit that, and I get an alert box. Or I can do a console log, something else, a different message, and that will log to my console. So this is a very quick way to check things. For example, check a variable value, maybe debug your code, or do very simple operations. So for example, I can do stuff like 5 plus 4 and it gives me 9. I can do arithmetic operations. I can do Boolean operations. So if I say 1 is higher than 5, it gives me false. All sorts of stuff. The second way is by writing it inline in your HTML document. And first, you can, for example, go to an element and say stuff like on click, for example, and type your JavaScript code. So let's do an alert here and say clicked. Then refresh, and when I hit this, it gives me an alert. Or you can use script tags. So script also adds this type text JavaScript. You can leave it, but it's not necessary. So you can just do script. And then inside you can type your JavaScript code. So for example, console log 10 times 5. And that's going to give us 50 on the console. Finally, the third way of writing and running JavaScript is by using a dedicated JavaScript file. So, for example, I'm going to create a new file here called script.js, and I'm going to do a console log from here that says this is a log from a dedicated JS file. And then we actually have to load that JavaScript file. And we're going to do it in the footer of our document. We're going to say script. We're going to delete this, and we're going to specify a source to script.js. We're not going to type anything inside the script, only setting its src. So now refresh, and we have that log entry. And these are the 3 methods you can use for writing JavaScript. Now, for the upcoming lessons, go ahead and pick the one that you feel most comfortable with. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the first one because while it is good for quick checks and very simple things, it's not very suitable for large blocks of code. Instead, I'll be using the second and the third, depending on the lesson. In the next lesson, you'll learn everything there is to know about variables. I'll see you there. Welcome to lesson number 2, where you'll learn about variables. Now, if you've ever worked with a CSS preprocessor, like less or Sass, then you're already familiar with variables. These store values of specific data types. For example, you can store numbers, you can store strings of characters, and so on. So in JavaScript, things are very similar. To declare a variable, that's where you start, right? You declare a variable, and you do that with the keyword var. Now, following this keyword var is the name of the variable or the identifier. Now, you have to be careful when naming your variable because identifiers have specific rules. They can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. They must begin with a letter. So, for example, if I do 3 or 2 followed by some letters, that's not valid. The names can also begin with a dollar sign and underscore, but we're not going to use them in this tutorial. And also names are case sensitive. So Bob here is different than Bob with a capital B. These are two different variables. Also remember that reserved keywords from JavaScript are also prohibited from being used as identifiers. So for example, if I do var, that's not correct because var is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So let's name a simple variable, let's say item, and then we're going to end that line. If you want to define another variable, you can do again var item2. But you can also do it var item colon and then item2. Now this right here is not a valid identifier because it has a space. So either concatenate them like this or use an underscore. Now, how do you set a value in a variable? Well, after you've defined the variables, you can call them like this, item equals, and you can specify a value. I'm going to say 5 here, and then item2 equals 2. I'm going to put a string. I'm going to say hello. So now, the variable item holds the value of 5 and the variable item2 holds the value of hello, and this is a string. So how do you call these variables? Well, very simply by their name or by their identifier. So if I go back in our page here and I open up the console and I say item, that's going to print 5. If I say item2, that's going to print hello. If I say item space 2, it's going to give me a syntax error. So that's the easiest way to work with variables. Now, variables also have something that's called scope. And scope refers to the context in which these variables are available. If you define a variable like this, the way I did it, item2, they have a global scope, which means they are available globally. But as you'll find out in a later lesson, you can also create a local scope inside, for example, a function or a specific block of code. In that case, that variable which has a local scope is only available within that function or that block of code. But I'm just mentioning this right now. We'll go into in more detail further down the line. But that's about it for variables, just a quick lesson. Now, as I was saying in the beginning, variables can hold multiple data types, and we'll be learning about that in the next lesson. See you there. Hello, and welcome to lesson number 3 of this course, where you'll learn about the data types in JavaScript. And there are 7 data types in total. 5 of them are primary, 2 are composite. Let's go ahead and start with the primary ones. These are string, number, boolean, null, and undefined. The string is basically a group of characters. So you would say, for example, var name equals John. That's a string. And you can use double quotes, and you can also use single quotes, but it's usually preferred to use double quotes. The number data type would be something like this, age 32. This is written without any kind of quotes. If you would put 32 inside quotes, it would then be treated as a string instead of a number. Now, numbers can be either integers like this or floating points like this, 32.12. That's a valid number. The next type is Boolean. Now, Boolean is a special type because it can only hold two values, very different from the other two types. It can be true or false. So I can say something like married equals true or equals false. The fourth primary data type is null. Now, the null data type has a single value in JavaScript, and that is null. And it's usually used to erase the contents of a variable without deleting the variable itself. All you have to do, for example, is set age to null, and age will have no value whatsoever. Finally, the undefined data type usually happens when you're trying to access an object property that doesn't exist, or you're trying to access a variable that has not been given a value. So for example, if I set a variable here called car model, for example, and I go back here and I say car model, it's going to return undefined, while if I say age, it's going to give him back null. So you see the difference between the two. But if I say name, it's going to return John. So those are the 5 primary data types. Now, before we move on, I just want to quickly show you something called type of. Now, type of is an operator, and you do something like this, type of, and it's followed by an operand. So watch what happens if I say type of age. Type of age gives me an object. But if I say type of name, it's going to give me a string. Let's try type of car model. It gives me undefined. So what happens is when you're using the type of operator, it's going to return the type or the data type of the operand. So for example, if I say type of false, it gives me Boolean. If I say type of false in double quotes, it's going to give me string. So it's a very nice way of checking the type of a variable. And this can be used in lots of different ways. For example, when you're doing some operations between two variables, and first you want to make sure that they have the same type to prevent errors. Now, that's pretty much it for the primary data types. The composite data types I mentioned earlier are arrays and objects. There are 2 of them, and we'll be learning about those in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 4, where you'll learn about the first composite data type in JavaScript, which is arrays. Now, an array is basically a list of values. And the way you can declare one is simply var. Let's call it list equals, and we'll use square brackets, and we can put in the list of values. For example, I can say John, Marie, and we separate these by commas, and Sander. Well, I can think of a better name there. So this is an array which has 3 string items, but you're not limited to string items. You can have an array of booleans or an array of numbers, or you can mix and match. So for example, I can add another one here that says 32, or I can put another one here that says false, right? So this is a valid array. Now, this is the first method of declaring an array. You can also declare an array like this. So for example, list2 equals this. This is an empty array, but it's an array nonetheless. Or let's call this list3 equals new array. And here you can also specify its content. So for example, 12 and false. This is a valid syntax. Now, this is how you declare an array. But how do you access it? Well, just like you would access any normal variable. So if I go back in here and I say, for example, list, it's going to give me my array. John, Marie, Sander, 32, and false. Or list 2, it's going to give me an empty array. Or list 3, it's going to give me the third array that we've just created. Now, this will give you the entire array, but what if you want to access a specific element from that array? Well, to do that, you would say list, you open up square brackets, and you specify a number from 0 to whatever you want, basically. Arrays are zero-based index, which means the first item sits on position 0, the second item sits on position 1, and so on and so forth. So if I say list 0, it's going to give me John. If I say list 2, it's going to give me the third item, which is Sander. If I say list 5, it's going to give me undefined. Now, why is it giving me undefined? Well, because our array has 5 elements. So its element count only goes up to 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5 items. So if I specify an index, this is what it's called. If I specify an index that's larger than the length of the array, it's going to give me undefined. But if I say list 4, it's going to give me the item on the 5th position. Now, the way to access these arrays is the same regardless of how you define them in the first place, either using the this syntax or using the new array syntax. Now, arrays have properties and they have methods. Properties, we're only going to talk about one, and that is length. And the length property gives you the number of items from that array. The way to access that property is with the array name. In our case, let's do list dot length. And list.length is going to give me 5 because I have 5 items. List2.length is going to give me 0 because it's an empty array, and list3.length is going to give me 2 because we have 2 items in that array. A very simple property that you can use to find the number of items in an array. Now let's move on to the methods because these are a bit more interesting. The methods we're going to be talking are push, pop, shift, unshift, and index of. The push method will add an item to the end of an array. So I have my list array here, and if I want to add another item, I can just say list.push, and then in parentheses I'm going to put my item, and that can be anything: boolean, number, null, string, whatever. So I'm just going to put a string, and I'm going to say hi. So now it gives me the new length of my array, and if I do list again, I get the updated array. So that's push. Pop will actually remove an item from the end of the array. So I can say list.pop, make sure you use parentheses because this is a method, and that gave me the item that was removed from my list. So if I redo, you'll find that we now have an array with just 5 items. The third method is called shift, and it's used to remove an item from the front or the start of an array. So if we do list shift, it removed John. As you can see, John is now gone. Now to add to the front of an array, you would use unshift. So list unshift, I'm going to add 10 here. Yeah, so now list is this bit. Finally, index of is used to find the index of a specific item in an array. So let's say, for example, that I want to find a position of the number 32 in my array. So I can do list index of 32, and that gives me 3, right? So we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. But if I do index of this bit, it actually tells me that it's not defined, but if I do index of 32, 32, it gives me -1. And this is the value that's returned in case that item is not found in the array. And that's pretty much it for arrays. Now, coming up, we'll talk about the second composite data type, which is objects. See you there. Hello, and welcome to lesson number 5, where we learn about objects. Now, objects in JavaScript are, I think, pretty easy to understand, and it all starts from properties. A property is an association between a name and a value. For example, color equals red. That's a property. Properties can also have functions as values, in which case those properties are called methods, but we'll come back to that. Now, objects are collections of properties, plain and simple. So let's have a look at how you can create an object, how you can access it, and all that good stuff. To create an object, you start, of course, with a variable, and let's call this a variable person. And we're going to say new object. That's one way to create it. Another way is to create, let's say, car equals curly brackets. So just like arrays, where we used square brackets to create them, or the syntax new array, objects, we use new object and curly brackets instead of square brackets. And what you can do now is start adding properties to these objects. So for example, person, what could we want to know about that person? We want to know its name, its age, maybe its height, right? So you can say person dot name equals, let's say, James. Person dot age equals, I don't know, 43. Person dot height equals 1.76. And actually this should be a number instead of a string. And we can also say person dot married equals true. So now, if we type person in our terminal here, we get an object with name, age, height, married set to the values you just saw. You can also access these properties in the following way. Person, square brackets, and then inside double quotes, the name of the property. Person name equals, let's change this to Kirk. Refresh. And now if we bring up person, it's going to give me Kirk for its name. And that's how you can access these properties and also how to change these properties. Both syntaxes are valid, but probably the dot followed by the name of the property is the easiest one to use. Now, you can use objects inside objects in the way that an object is the value for a property. So, for example, if I add another property here called car, or let's not confuse it with this one here. Let's just delete this. Yeah. So I'm going to say person.car equals a new object. And then I can go and say person.car.make equals Honda, for example. Right? So now if I recall person, it gives me this object. And if I do person.car, it gives me another object. And if I do person.car.make, it gives me Honda. So this is how you can access these object properties even if they're embedded in one another. Now, you can also define these properties when you first initialize an object. So for example, let's delete this, and I can say var person equals, and I can specify it like this: name, Adi, age 30. Notice the syntax here is a little bit different. So now when I access person, I get this object. As I was saying in the beginning, objects can also have methods, and a method is simply a property that has a function as its value. But we didn't learn about functions just yet, so there's no point in me talking about object methods right now. What I gave you right here are the basics of objects. How you can create them, how you can use them, how you can access their various properties. And with objects, we've actually completed all 7 data types in JavaScript. Now, coming up in the next lesson, we'll learn about the available operators in JavaScript. See you there. Hi, welcome to lesson number 6, where you'll learn about operators. And there are a few different types. Let's begin with the assignment operator, since this is the most basic. Now, the assignment operator will basically assign a value to its left operand based on the value of its right operand. And the simplest one is the equal operator. So let's say, for example, that I have a variable x equals 1. We assign the value of 1, the right operand, to x, the left operand. So now if I type x, that's going to be equal to 1. I can also have a variable, for example, y equals 3. And then what I can do is say x equals y. And now x will have the value of 3. So that's the basic form. Now there are also compound assignment operators. For example, the addition assignment. That looks something like this. X equals x plus y. And that gives us 6. But I can also say x plus equal y. X plus equal y is the same thing as x equals x plus y. Similar to these are subtraction, multiplication, division, and a bunch of others. But I'm just going to show you a few examples here. So the subtraction will be x minus equal y. The multiplication is going to be x multiply equal y. And the division will be x slash equal y. And just like the addition assignment, you can already deduce their full form. So for example, the subtraction is x equals x minus y. And that's a quick look at the assignment operator. Now let's move on to the comparison and logical operators. And the comparison operator will basically compare its operands and return a Boolean value based on the result of that comparison. So if the comparison is true, it's going to return true. If it's not, it's going to return false. Now, I'm sure you already know what the comparison operators are. It's equal to, it's greater than, smaller than, greater than or equal to, and so on and so forth. So you see where I'm going here. Let's see a few examples. So if I say x is higher than y, it's going to give me true because currently x is 6, y is 3. But if I say x equal to y, it's going to give me false because those two values are not equal. I can also say x not equal to y, and that's going to return true. And there's also a strict equal that I want to show you real quick. So if I say x strict equal, so 3 equal signs, y, it's going to give me false. But if I set y to 6, and then I repeat x strict equal y, it's going to give me true. But what if I'm doing x equals 6? So instead of a number, I'm assigning a string to the y variable, right? Then if I say x equals y, it's going to give me true because it's 6 and 6. But if I say x is strict equal y, it's going to give me false. And that's because strict equals also considers the operand type. If you do just is equal, so two equal signs, it's just going to compare the value, while strict equal is going to look at the type as well. Now, the logical operators are and, or, and not. So and, let's say, for example, x equals true and y equals false. If I say x and y, it's going to give me false because the and operator will return true if both operands are true, otherwise it's going to return false. If I do x or y, it's going to give me true because the OR logical operator will return true if either of the operands is true. If both are false, it's going to return false. Finally, the logical NOT operator will basically switch things around. So x is currently true, but if I say not x, it's going to return false. And y is currently false. So if I say not y, it's going to give me true. Basically, the not operator is going to return false if its operand can be converted to true. Otherwise, it's going to return true. Now, let's talk about the arithmetic operators. And you've already seen a few like plus, minus. These are arithmetic operators. But there are a few that are a bit more special, and I would like to show you those. So first of all, we're going to talk about the increment operator, and this is a unary operator, which means it only needs one operand. It's not like, for example, the equal operator, which needs two operands, right? So the increment operator basically will add 1 to its operand. So for example, if we set x to 3, and I say x plus plus, and I read x after that, it's going to give me 4. So what happens is x plus plus will first print x, and then it's going to increment it by 1. If I do plus plus x, it's going to give me 5, because it's first going to increment it, and then it's going to print it. Same goes with decrement, also a unary operation. Instead of adding 1 to its operand, it subtracts 1. So if I say x minus minus, x is going to be equal to 4. And it also works the other way around, minus minus x. Now, there is also a unary negation and unary plus. And the unary negation basically will return the negation of its operand. So x is currently 3. If I say minus x, it's going to give me minus 3. The unary plus will actually attempt to convert its operand to a number, if, of course, it's not already. So, for example, plus 3 will give me 3. But if I have plus and the string of 3, it's going to give me 3. It's going to transform that type into a number. If I say, for example, plus true, it's going to give me 1. Plus false is going to give me 0, because 0 and 1 are considered false and true. Finally, we're going to talk about the concatenation operator, or the plus, and that can be applied to a string. So, for example, if we're going to set some strings here, for example, x equals hello, and y is going to equal to world, right? What I can do is say x plus y, and that's going to give me hello world. I can also do something like x plus equal, and I can add another string to it. For example, hello again, and that's going to give me hello, hello. And I can also do this. 32 plus 32, 32 is going to give me that big string. And that's a very quick look at operators in JavaScript. Now, there is a programming concept that I think is essential for any kind of JavaScript developer. And that is the if-else statement. Again, if you've done computer science in school, then you already know what that is. But we're going to cover that in the next lesson. See you there. Hello and welcome to lesson number 7, where you'll learn about the if-else statement. And this is something essential for any kind of programmer. The if-else statement allows you to execute various blocks of code if a specific condition is met. So first, let's have a look at the if statement. So the syntax is very simple. If, we open some parentheses, and in here we put a condition. So let's begin by declaring a variable x equals 5. And I can say if x equals 5, then we're going to do a console log true. And If I do a refresh, I get a console log of true. Now, what happens here is, first, JavaScript evaluates this expression. Is x equal to 5? Yes, it is. If true, then we do the console log. So it's the same thing as saying if true. It's going to have the same result. Or if 1. 1 is also interpreted as true. But if I say if x equals to 51, for example, nothing's going to happen because this condition is going to be evaluated. It's going to be evaluated to false, actually, and the code inside the curly brackets is not going to be run. Well, in that case, we can specify else. So if this condition is not met, then we do this. And I'm going to say console log false. And you can actually chain these together, right? So let's make a better example here. Let's say age, var age equals 24, right? So we're going to say if age is smaller than, let's say, 20, we're going to log to the console teenager. Else, if age is higher or equal than 20 and age equals smaller than 70, then we're going to log a young man. Else, we're going to log not so young anymore. So let's see what happens. If I do a refresh, it tells me I'm a young man. But if I change my age here to, for example, 70, it tells me that I'm not so young anymore because 70 doesn't actually fall in these two categories. If I would say smaller or equal than 70, it's gonna still say I'm a young man. So this is how the if-else statement works. Now, finally, I want to show you another operator that's called a ternary operator or a conditional operator. And that goes something like this. This is actually a special case because it's the only JavaScript operator that takes 3 operands. And let's do a simple if-else. I'm going to say if age is higher than 20, then I'm going to console log not a teen anymore. I'm going to do else console log teen. And let me just comment this bit. Okay, so now it tells me not a teen anymore. Well, this I can actually compress to this. Age higher than 20, question mark, console log not a teen anymore, colon, console log teen. And let's see, it does exactly the same thing. And this is the way it works. The expression here, or the condition, is evaluated. And if it's true, we're going to execute the code after the question mark. If it's not true, we're going to execute this code. So a more simple version would be this condition, val1, val2. So if this is true, execute this, otherwise execute this. And that's how you can use the if-else statement. Now, let's move on and talk about loops. That's coming up next. Hello and welcome to lesson number 8, where you'll learn about loops in JavaScript. Well, a loop is a piece of code that executes repeatedly either a set number of times or until a certain condition is met. And if you've worked with Sass and you've used the for, each, and while directives, then you already know what loops are all about. Now, when it comes to JavaScript, we have three main types of loops. We have the for, we have the do, while, and we have the while. So let's begin with the for loop. A for loop will repeat until a specified condition evaluates to false. And we go something like this. For, we open some parentheses, then we'll have an initial expression. Now, the initial expression can be or is mostly used to initialize a variable or a counter. So for example, I can say var x equals 1. And then I'm going to do a semicolon, and then follows the condition. Now, the condition is the thing that's going to be evaluated. And if that value of the condition is true, then the loop will execute, or the loop statement. If the value is false, then the loop terminates. So, for example, let's say x is going to be smaller than 10. And I'm going to do a semicolon again. And then third, we have the incremental expression. And this is usually used to increment the counter. So I can say, for example, x plus plus. And then we're going to open some curly braces, and we're going to have the main statement, or the block of code that's going to be executed. So let's say, for example, that I'm going to do a console log for x, and that's going to be printing 9 numbers in the console from 1 to 9. Now, if I say x smaller or equal than 10, it's going to print 10 of them, because the condition evaluates to true when we reach number 10. Now, if you're wondering, well, what can I use loops for? Well, you can use them for a bunch of different things. For example, we have that names array. What if we want to print all of the names in that array? Well, we can do something very simple. For example, for var x, or you can call it whatever you want, y equals 0. We're starting from 0 because an array's index is 0 based. So we're going to say y is smaller than names.length y plus plus. And then we simply do console log names of y. And that's going to print George, Margaret, and Sean. So what I did here, I started from 0. I'm going up until names.length, which in my case is 3. So we're going 0, 1, and 2. We're incrementing y as we go along, and we're outputting those names to the console. Next, let's move on to the do-while statement. And the do-while statement will repeat until a specific condition evaluates to false. And a do-while statement looks something like this. Do, and we'll have the statement here, while, and we'll type our condition. So for example, let's declare a variable here called x equals, well, let's actually delete the 4. Yeah, we're going to do var x 0. So we're going to do console log names of x. We're going to do x plus plus, and we're going to do this while x is smaller than names.length. And this will print George, Margaret, and Sean. But let me show you another example. Let's say that we have a do while statement that looks something like this. Do console log x while x is higher than 0. And let's actually comment this bit. And refresh, it prints 0. Now, why is this happening? Because x is 0, so this condition here is not met. Well, that's what do while does. The statement is executed at least once, regardless of how the condition is, or to what the condition is evaluated to. Now, on the flip side, we have the while statement, which is very similar to this. The only difference is the while statement will execute, or the while loop will execute the statement only if the condition is met. So, for example, we have while x higher than 0, we're going to console log x. And if we're going to comment this and refresh, we have nothing. That statement, console log x, has not been executed. But if we do while x is smaller than 5, and we do console log x plus plus, we're going to get this result. That's the difference between do while and while. Now, have you ever heard of mixins in CSS preprocessors? Well, if you have, then you should know that JavaScript and pretty much every programming language out there has something called functions. And functions are very interesting, very cool. You can do lots of things with them, and we'll learn about them in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 9, where we'll talk about functions. You can think about functions as subprograms that can have their own name, can be called anytime, they can receive parameters, and they can also return values. Now, to work with functions, you must first declare a function, and you do that with the keyword function. Then you would give that function a name. So to give you a very simple example, let's say print to console. And then you would open parentheses, and in the parentheses you can specify a list of parameters that it can then pass on to the function. So let's, for example, say message here, and I'm going to open curly brackets, and then inside you would put the code that's going to be executed by the function. Let's do, for example, console log message, right? So then what I can do is say print to console, and I can pass in hello, and that's going to print hello. Of course, this is redundant because console log can already do this. We don't need an extra function for that, but I just wanted to show like what you can do with that function. I can also do something like this. I can, for example, function add, and I can say value 1, value 2. I can do a console log of val1 plus val2, and in here I can pass, for example, I can say add 45 and 2, and that's going to print 47 to the console. As I was saying, functions can also return values. So, for example, instead of doing a console log here, I can simply return val1 plus val2. And then what I can do is say console log add 45 and 2. And that's going to print the exact same thing. So I'm basically saying console log, I'm calling this function, I'm passing in 45 and 2, and then I'm using the value that the function returns, and I'm going to print it to the console. So that's how functions work, really. It's very, very simple. Now, functions can also be declared like this. For example, let's do the square of a number. So we're going to say square equals function, and we're going to pass in a number, and then we're simply going to return number multiplied by number. So for example, if we say console log square 2, it's going to print out 4. Now, before we wrap things up with functions, I want to talk about something that I mentioned when we talked about variables, and that is variable scope. Back then I said that variable scope means the context in which that variable is available. And we have global variables and we have local variables. So now that we got to functions, I think this is a pretty good time to demonstrate that. So for example, let's say var x equals 3. Now this is defined in the global scope. It's not inside any kind of block quote. And that means the variable x is available anywhere. So, for example, if I say a function test, and I would simply do a console log of x, and then I call it, let me actually clean this up a little bit here, and then I call test, that's going to print 3. Now, let's say I have another function here, and we're going to call this test2. And let's declare a y variable in here that's going to be equal to 5. Well, if I'm going to go into test, and I'm going to say console log y, it's going to tell me that y is not defined. But if I do the exact same test in the test2 function, let's uncomment this and let's call test2, it's going to give me 5. So the variable y is only available in the scope of this function. It's not available anywhere else, like the x variable, which is global. Also, let's do something like this. We're going to say var x equals 10. And we're going to do a console log of x here, and also a console log of x here. So first we're executing test, and we're doing a console log of x, and then we're doing a console log of x in the global scope. So now if we refresh, we have two values, 10 and 3. Even though the variable is called x, it has different values in different scopes. The global variable is called, has the value of 3, and it's only available here, and this x variable has a value of 10. So this console log actually prints this one, not the global one. And that's a very quick introduction to functions. Now, as a web designer, probably one of the main things you'll be using JavaScript for is to manipulate the DOM, or the document object model, essentially your web page. And the easiest way to do that is with the help of selectors. That's what we'll be learning in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 10, where we'll talk about selectors. Now, selectors are great. They give you access to the DOM and allow you to manipulate it even. And these selectors are tied really well into the document and window objects. And if you remember from the objects lesson, an object is a collection of properties, basically, properties and methods. And by using these properties and methods, you can gain access to various elements in your DOM and do various things with it. Now, in this lesson, I'm going to show you some of the more popular or well-known selectors that you'll find yourself using as a web designer. So the first thing, let's actually show you the page I have here. It's a simple demo page. We have some unordered lists, a bunch of IDs on both of these. We have 4 images, all with a class of myIMG, and each one with its different ID, and then a couple of paragraphs. Now, let's start with this. I'm going to do a console log for document.body. And let me actually open the inspector here. Right, and this gives me body. Now, body is an object, and you can see all of its properties. You can get a lot of information about this. For example, client height, client width, the inner text, the inner HTML. Down here we have events. We'll learn about those in the next lesson. But basically, this is a very simple way to access these properties. Or document images, for example. Document images is going to give you this HTML collection, right? So we have your images here, and you can learn various properties for them, like the base URI. You can learn the alt, the class name, width, height, the SRC, and so on. So by having access to these, you can actually start using selectors and manipulate them, do various things with them. So let's see a couple of examples. Let's say, for example, that I want to grab the very first item, which is this item 1. How exactly would you do this? Well, we're going to go right here, and I'm going to say this. var first item equals, we're going to get the document object, and we're going to use the following method, get element by ID, and in here we're going to put the ID of item-1, because that's what we have in the DOM, as you can see here, ID item-1. Right, so if we do a console log for this first item, it's going to give us the item itself. Right, so that's the first method that I want you to remember, get element by ID. It returns the first element that it finds in the DOM with that particular ID. Now, this will just return one element, because if you want your HTML to be valid, IDs are unique. So you cannot have two elements with the same ID. So that's why this method, this function, basically returns a single element. Okay, now let's say that you want to get access to these two ULs, right? So they both have the class of myList. Well, to get elements with the same class, you would do document get elements, plural, by class name. And we're going to say myList. Yeah, so now myList gives me these two unordered lists. What about getting elements by their tag name, which means get all the images, all the paragraphs? Well, that's also easy to do. You can say, for example, paragraph equals document get elements by tag name p paragraph. And that's going to select these three paragraphs here. Now, if you've used jQuery, you remember how you would do selectors there. You would do something very close to CSS selectors, right? Well, you have something similar in vanilla JavaScript, and that's with a method called query selector all. So for example, let's say that I want to select all the images. Well, I can just say images equals document dot query selector all, and I would pass in a CSS selector. In my case, it's img, and that will select all the images. Okay, so now you have all of these variables which reference objects in your or elements in your page. How do you manipulate them? Well, first of all, you can start with the CSS properties by using the style property. So you would say something like, for example, first item, you would say style dot and then color, and you would change that to something else, for example, red. So now the first item is red. Then what if you want to hide this second list? Well, let's think about it. MyList is actually an array. That's what getElementsByClassName returns. So it's an array. You're going to access it like this, MyList. You're going to pass in an index. I'm going to say 1 because we have two items, and it's a 0-based index, so we have 0 and 1. So MyList1 style display equals none. And that will essentially hide my second list. Then let's say that I want to change the color of all of my paragraphs to green. Well, you can actually use, you can do it by hand, or you can use a loop. So for example, we're going to say for var I equals 0, I smaller than paragraphs dot length. Paragraphs dot length works here because paragraphs is an array. I++, we're going to say paragraphs I style color green. So now all of these paragraphs are green, and that's how you can manipulate the DOM using selectors and a loop. Now, the list here can go on and on, but these are the basics. This is what most people use. This is what you'll mostly be using to access elements in your DOM. And we're going to leave it at this. You're going to see more complex examples when we get to the demos at the end of this course. Now, JavaScript also allows us to work with events, and that's what we'll be learning in the next lesson. See you there. Hello and welcome to lesson number 11, where you'll learn about JavaScript events. And actually, JavaScript events is a bit improper because the events are happening on the HTML side. All you can do in JavaScript is listen to these events and react accordingly. Now, an event can be something triggered either by the browser, like, for example, when the page has finished loading, the browser triggers an event, or when an image has finished downloading from the server, then the browser triggers another event. Or they can be something triggered by the user, like for example when you click a button. Now the list of events is like a mile long, and we're not going to go through all of them. Instead, we're just going to pick 4, which are probably the ones that you're going to be using the most, and I'm going to show you how to listen to these events and how to react to them. And there are 2 ways you can listen to them, either in HTML inline or in JavaScript with add event listener. Now, the test page I have here is very simple. We have a paragraph in a container and a button. And of course, clicking this button does nothing for now. But what you can do is say on click, and you can execute some JavaScript code. So for example, you can say something like console log button clicked. So now when I click the button, I get a console log. So that was a piece of JavaScript that you just executed. This is the simplest way to tie into an event like click, for example. There are other events, for example, like on load, on mouse over, on key up. These are just a few examples. Now, let me show you how to listen to these events from JavaScript or using JavaScript code. So in my scripts file here, I'm going to declare some variables first. Submit btn, it's going to be document, get element by ID, submit, and then I'm going to target the container equals document. I'm just going to say query selector container. Now, I'm going to get the submit button, and I'm going to use the function add event listener. It looks like this. Add event listener. We're going to pass in the name of the event that we want to listen to. In our case, it's click. And then we're going to specify what happens when that event is being triggered. We can pass in a function name, or we can declare an anonymous function here. So we're going to say function. We're going to pass in the event parameter. And then we're going to say console log, hey, I've been clicked. I'm just going to escape this character right there. Okay, so now if I click this, we get 2 different console logs. One is from the onClick in the HTML, and the second one is from the add event listener from JavaScript. Now let's see an example of another event, for example, mouse enter. And let's say that when I enter with my mouse cursor in the container area, I want to do something, do a console log, anything. So I'm going to say container add event listener. We're going to pass in the event name. In our case, it's mouse enter, and the function name or the function that we want to execute. In my case, I'm going to say mouse enter container. Now this is a function that I'm going to create right now. So function mouse enter container, it does not receive any parameters, but instead it does a console log that says, hey, there was a mouse enter event triggered. So now whenever I take my cursor and I enter the boundaries of my container element, I get that console log. You can see by the number here, we already have 10 logs. But let's say that I want to do this just once, right? So do the console log just the first time the event is triggered. Well, to do that, I can simply do the console log and then remove the event listener. So I can say container remove event listener mouse enter and then the name of the function. So the syntax is exactly the same as add event listener, but we change the name of the function here. So now I enter the boundaries of the container, I get the console log, but I only get it once. All right, let me show you another example real quick for the event key up, right? So we're going to say document add event listener key up function event. Now, this is a great way to show you what that event is doing. I'm doing a console log event key code. Now, event is an object that's being transmitted to this function, and you can access various properties for that object, such as key code, which is the code of the key you just pressed. So, for example, if I start typing, you'll see that we get various codes. If I do an enter, we get the code 13. If I do escape, I get 27. So this is a really great way to listen for key presses. To give you an example of what you'll be using this for, or what you could be using it for, you make a slider, an image slider, and you would use the right and left arrow keys. You can see their codes pop up just right there, 39 and 37, to switch slides, right, to move between slides. So that's one use for them. But yeah, basically that's about it for JavaScript events. Now, you've learned the basics of JavaScript, so it's time to put this knowledge to good use by creating some demos for some of the most common coding patterns in JavaScript. And we'll begin in the next lesson with a back to top button. See you there. Hi, welcome to lesson number 12. This is the first of our 5 demos. And in this lesson, we're going to create a back to top button. Now, I'm sure you've seen this around. It's a very common pattern. And the way this works, basically, you have a web page, and when you scroll past a certain point, you'll get a little back to top button somewhere on the page. Usually it's on the bottom part of the page, and when you click it, you're taken back up to the top of the page. So let's go ahead and see how we can create something like that using pure or vanilla JavaScript if you want. Now, taking a look at the markup here, we have a header with an ID of top. We're going to use this ID to tell our script where we need to go back to. Then we have our main content with a bunch of paragraphs, and finally a footer. And in the footer, we have an anchor tag with an ID of back to top. This is our button. As far as styling is concerned, we just have some generic demo style here, nothing fancy really. But what we're interested in is this back to top button, right? So its position is fixed, so no matter how or no matter where we scroll, it stays in the same position. It's in the bottom right corner, 3 M's from each side. It's white with a 0.9 in the alpha channel. It's set to inline block. Currently it has an opacity of 0, so we cannot see it. And we also have a class visible, which gives it an opacity 1. So what we need to do basically is when we scroll past a certain point in our page, we're going to add that class to the button, making it visible. And we also have to listen to the click event on the button and make our page scroll all the way back to the top. Now, I'm going to write the script right here on the bottom of the page. And I'm going to start by defining some variables. And then what we're going to do is calculate the document height, and we're going to set the offset to 1/4 of that value. And finally, we're going to add event listeners for scroll and click. Right, now for variables, we're going to target the button, so BTT, back to top. We're going to say document, get element by ID, back to top. Then we're going to get the body to document body, doc elem, that's going to be document element. We'll be needing this when we calculate the height of our page. Then we're going to set the offset to 100, for example, and 2 more variables. We'll declare scroll position and doc height. Now let's calculate the document height. We're going to say doc height equals math.max. Basically, math.max will take a bunch of values and it's going to return the biggest one, the maximum of those values. And the reason we're doing this is because different browsers will look at a document height differently. So, for example, Firefox is going to have a different syntax to get the document height. WebKit is going to have another one. So, just to make sure we cover as many browsers as we need, we're doing this math max, and we're going to pass in the following values: body.scroll height, body.offset height, doclm client height, and scroll height, and finally we're going to get the offset height. Now we'll do a quick check. If document height is different than undefined, which means if math max actually returned something, which means if we actually have a height value, then we're going to set the offset to doc height divided by 4. This value 100 is just a fallback, right? In case doc height actually turns out undefined for some reason, then we do have something to fall back on. Next up, we're going to add the scroll event listener. And actually before that, let's go ahead and do a quick refresh here and go to our console and call the offset. And as you can see, the offset is 737.5. Now, which means our script will be executed after we scroll past 737.5. Now, for the scroll event listener, we're going to do window, add event listener. Yeah, we're going to listen for scroll, and we're going to have a function. We're going to get the scroll position equals to body.scroll top, or in case that's not valid, doclm.scroll top. Again, this is for various browsers. And then we're going to say btt class name equals to, if the scroll position is higher than the offset, then we're going to add the class of visible. Oops, sorry. It's the other way around. Otherwise, we're going to add nothing. So that's what we're doing here, basically. This is the ternary operator, if you remember, or the conditional operator. We're checking if the scroll position is higher than the offset. So basically, if we passed that threshold when we scrolled, we add the class of visible to the button, to the BTT. Otherwise, we add nothing to the class name. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Refresh, and let's see, there it is. So when we scroll, past that point, we make the button visible, and when we go back up, we're hiding it. Okay, now let's actually make this button work. So when we click it, we want it to go to the very top. So we're going to say add click event listener. BTT add event listener, click, again, function event. First thing we'll do is say event prevent default, and that's to make sure that the button, or in our case, it's an anchor tag, it doesn't go anywhere. That's what this function is doing. And then we're going to check if our browser is Firefox, then we need to set the scroll top value in a different way. So what we got to do here is define another variable called isFirefox. And isFirefox, actually this is very easy to do. We got to check for the navigator user agent. So let me actually, I'm going to say true here, just so we have valid code. But I want to open the inspector here. And what I'm going to do is say navigator.userAgent. And navigator user agent is going to give us this bit. Yeah, and an easy way to check if this is Firefox, well, it says Firefox right here. So all we got to do is compare that string to the word Firefox. So is Firefox will be equal to the following: navigator dot user agent dot. We're going to use a method called toLowerCase, which will take a string. It's going to make it lowercase, and then I'm going to say index of Firefox is higher than -1. All right, so if you don't understand what happened here, let me tell you. Navigator user agent will give us that string you saw in the console. toLowerCase is going to make everything lowercase, and then index of Firefox basically means at which position is the word Firefox in that string. And if it returns a position that's higher than -1, it means the string, the word Firefox is within that string. Otherwise, it isn't there. And this is a comparison. So it returns true or false. So coming back down here, we're going to say if is Firefox. Then we're going to say doclm, scroll top equals 0. Otherwise, we're going to set body scroll top equals to 0. So now refresh, and when I'm down here, I click the button. It's going to take me back to the very top. And now that I think of it, I actually said in the beginning that we're going to use this ID to bring us back to the top. Not really necessary, to be honest, because the way we're getting to top is we're setting this property here, scroll top equals 0. So we might as well just get rid of this, unless it has value in styling, which I don't really think it does. No, it doesn't. Okay, so we can actually get rid of this. That's about it for our button. Now, a small but interesting project is a text box that supports auto-completion. That will be demo number 2 and will be coming in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 13, where we'll create a text box that supports auto-completion. Now, this can be used for lots and lots of different things, but usually auto-completion is a feature that really helps out with the user experience when it comes to filling in forms, right? So imagine you have to fill in your country, right? And you start typing, and it would be useful to immediately, as you type, get a list of countries that match whatever it is you typed. Well, this is what we're gonna create in this lesson. So here we have our text box. Currently it doesn't do anything. And coming back to the markup, we see that it's very simple. It's an input type text in a form. It has an ID, a placeholder, and below that is an UL with an ID of autocomplete results. This is the element that we're going to populate with the various results we're going to get from autocompletion. So let's start our scripts file by declaring a couple of variables. We're going to get our actual input, we're going to get the results, and then we're going to specify our country list, and that's about it for now. So let's actually document our step here. Next up, we should focus the input when the page loads. So we say target input dot focus, and that, whenever we refresh now, the cursor is always in there. Next up, we have to add an event listener for the key up. So whenever we press a key into the input, we start comparing what we typed with what we have in our countries array. We're going to say target input, add event listener on key up. We execute the following function. Now, before we move on, we're going to need some useful key codes here. And these are 13 for enter, 38 arrow up, 40 arrow down. You'll see why we need these in just a little bit. Now, we're going to start by doing this results plural dot inner HTML. Now we'll reset this. So basically, if there were results previously shown, we're going to remove those. Next, we're going to hide the results element. And for that, we're actually going to write a function to which we can just pass in a parameter, and it's going to either show it or hide it. And the function is called toggle results, and we're going to say hide. So let's go ahead and write that function. And that function looks something like this. So action is either show or hide. And if the action is show, then we're going to get the results. We're going to add the class of visible. Otherwise, if the action is hide, we're going to remove the class of visible. Very, very simple. Now we're going to say if this dot value dot length is higher than 0, then. So what exactly does this mean? Well, this is an object, and it refers to target input in this case. So when we're doing this target input add event listener, we can actually use this object to reference target input. And it allows us to write code more elegantly and more efficiently. So if the value that we typed in that input has a length that's higher than 0, which means if we typed something, basically, then we're going to do the following. Matches equals to get matches this dot value. Now we have two unknowns here. Matches is actually a variable that we need to define, and it's an array. So matches equals array. And get matches is a function that we need to write. And that function will actually compare the value that we just typed with all the items in the array. And it's going to return an array of the items that match the value that we just typed. Maybe it sounds a bit confusing, but if you take a close look to the code, you'll see that it's actually very, very simple. So let's go ahead and write that get matches function. Now that function looks something like this. We're defining a match list array, and then we're parsing the country list array, which means we're going in a loop, in a for loop, from 0 to the last item. And then we're checking if the item to lowercase, index of, input text to lowercase, input text being this bit. So if the index of is different than -1, which means if the value that we typed in the text box is contained within that particular item from the country array. Well, in that case, we're going to do match list push that country list. We're populating the match list array with that country's name. And then we return match list. So now, coming back here, we'll do this. Matches dot length is higher than 0, which means if we have some country names returned by our function, then we're going to say display matches. Now, display matches is a function that we're going to write now, which will populate our autocomplete results and then show it. So what we're doing here basically is we're doing a while loop, and we're going through the entire match list array. Every single item will be appended as a list item with a class of result to the results element, which in our case is this UL. Then what we do is we toggle the results like this, or we show the results. So let's see if it works. Okay, let's do A, and you can already see that we have a few countries here: Albania, Colombia, Cuba, pretty much all the countries that contain the letter A. If I do AL, it shows me all the countries that have A and L. Albania, Nepal, Wales, and so on. And if I do ALB, it just shows me Albania. Let's do another one. Let's do Nepal. Let's do Romania. So as you can see, the script works beautifully. Now, what I want to do is to have a little bit more control over that list when using my keyboard. So for example, I want to be able to move through my results with the up and down arrow keys. And then when I hit enter, I want to fill my text box with that value. So let's make that happen. And we're going to start right here in our display matches function. We're going to say the first child gets a class of highlighted. And for this, we're going to say move cursor, results cursor. Again, two unknowns. Now, results cursor is a variable that we're going to initialize here. That should be equal initially to 0. And move cursor is a function that we're going to write now. Now, the move cursor function will basically move that highlighted class up or down depending on which key I press. So what we're doing is basically we're going through all of our results, we're removing the class of highlighted from all of them, and we're adding that one only on our position. So now, refresh. You can see that when I type something, the cursor or the highlight is on the very first item. Now, let's see what we can do about when we press the up and down arrow keys. And the place to write that code is right here in the key up event listener. So here we're going to say if results class list contains visible, so if there are results that are being shown, then we're going to do a switch. And a switch is a much more elegant form of writing multiple if-else statements. So we're going to do switch, and the criteria is going to be event.keycode, and then we're going to say case 13. We're going to have our block of code, and then we're going to have break case 38, again block of code and then break, and finally case 40, same deal. Okay, now what this means basically is check the event key code. If it's 13, execute the following. If it's 38, execute the following, and the same goes for 40. Now, this is where this comment comes in. You can see that 13 means enter, in which case I want to copy or I want to fill in my text box with the value that I've just highlighted. 38 and 40 arrow up and respectively down. So, in the case of an enter, I want to do the following. Target input value equals results children results cursor inner HTML. Well, results is our UL. Children means each individual list item. Result cursor is the position that's highlighted. And inner HTML basically means the text within that list item. That's all there is, really. So we're taking this value and we're assigning it to the target input value. So let's see that in action. Let's type Romania. If I hit enter, you can see that the page refreshed there. And that's because this is a form. Pressing enter in that form will automatically submit it and the page refreshes, but we don't want that. To prevent it, we're going to go right here and we're going to add event listener for the input key down. So we're going to say target input, add event listener, key down, function, and we're going to say if event key code equals 13, or if we pressed enter, we're going to say event.prevent default. And that, if we type Romania again, hit enter, for some reason this still doesn't work, so what's going on here? So add event listener, key down, function, sorry, I forgot to include the event here. Okay, let's do a refresh. So Romania, hit enter, and we now populate the text box. Let's do another test, Albania, enter. Okay, but when I hit enter, I want to actually hide this results element. So here we're going to say toggle results, hide, and also let's reset the cursor to 0. Okay, refresh. Let's try that again. Perfect. All right, now let's see about moving up and down in this list. On 38, which is arrow up, means we have to go up. We'll simply say if results cursor is higher than 0, then we'll simply do results cursor minus minus, and we're going to move the cursor to the new results cursor. Let's see, Albania, arrow up. Okay, let's actually do the arrow down first. Here we're going to say if results cursor is smaller than matches dot length minus 1, then we'll do results cursor plus plus and move cursor results cursor. Okay, let's do it again. So now when we hit the arrow down key, we can see that our cursor, well, apart from this pesky autocomplete thing from the browser, but when we hit the up and down arrow keys, you can see that we can cycle between our results, and hitting enter on one of them will fill that into our text box. And that's about it for this lesson. It's time to move on to our third demo. And I think that one is going to be pretty popular because it is a content slider. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 14. For our third demo, we'll have a look at a content slider, but we're not going to limit ourselves to just images as slides. Instead, our slider can really take on any kind of slide, text, HTML, whatever we can throw at it. Now, I'm going to show you the slide. It's the finished one. We just have some quotes here. We have the next button, the previous button, and we can cycle through them like this. When we are at the beginning, the back button doesn't work, and when we get to the end, the forward button doesn't work. So instead of wasting a lot of time writing this code, essentially you can just open the source files that come with the course and then just copy the code from there. I'm going to walk you through the code. I'm going to explain why I did what I did and what's the purpose of each function and of each piece of code. So first things first, let's have a look at the markup here to understand what's going on. So we have a container that has a slider container UL with an ID of slider, and each slide is basically a list item with a class of slide. So we start by defining a couple of variables. We're getting the slides, and we're getting the slider itself. We're setting the cursor to 0. Now the cursor is going to serve as a guide so that we know on which slide we are. We're also defining slide width, a top height. Top height will be used to find the height of the tallest slide. Slide count, of course, gives us the number of slides. Now, if we have slides, this is a check that we have to do, then we're getting the slide width. Now, why are we doing that? Because the way we're going to organize things is we're going to have the slides positioned absolutely, and we're just going to offset them by their height. So the slide that's currently being viewed is going to be at left 0, but the slide before it is going to be have the value left minus the slide width. The slide before that, the same way. And the slides after the current one are going to have the left value equal to plus the slide width. So let me actually show you that right here. If we take a look at the inspector, you're going to see that our slides have a style set. Look, this first one, 4,995 pixels, and then we decrement like this until we get to 0, which is the current slide. But if I'm gonna hit back, watch what happens with the left values. Now this slide is the current one, its left is at 0, and the one that was before is at left 999. We do back again. You'll notice that the value of the left property changes. So how are we achieving that? Well, we're setting the left value for each slide here. So we're doing a loop, and then on each slide we're setting its width times this counter plus pixels. So if each slide's width is 1000 pixels, then the first slide is going to be 1000 times 0 because the cursor is at 0. So that will be 0. The next one is going to be at 1000, the next one at 2000, and so on. Then we calculate the tallest slide. And calculate tallest slide is a function that basically runs through all of our slides, and it checks if the offset height of each slide is higher than the top height, or the current top height, then we're setting the top height to the height of that slide. And then what we're doing is we're setting the height of the entire slider to that top height. And we're doing this to ensure that all the slides are centered vertically. And of course, to do that, we need to know the biggest slide. Next, we're going to add the animated class to each slide. And the animated class will basically allow for that smooth slide. Well, slide is probably not a good term here, but the transition, right? So changing its left from 0 to minus 1000, for example, is made with a transition. Now, why aren't we adding this from the beginning? Well, if we did, when we refresh the page, all of the slides would just go flying on the screen because they would have that animated class. So instead, we're adding after all of the elements have loaded. Then we're adding event listeners for next and previous buttons, and we're checking if the cursor is smaller than the slide count -1, which means if we haven't reached the end, we move the slides forward and we increase the cursor. Same thing for this bit, only in reverse. Now move slides will take the direction, so it's either forwards or backwards. And what it's going to do is it will redo those left values, right? So the left values, as you saw when I showed you the inspector, when you're moving a slide, all of those values change. Let me show you again. So when I hit the next button, notice this slide here. We're going to the second one. So the first one gets a left of -999, second one is 0, next one is +999, and so on. And that's what this code here is doing basically. The replace that you see here basically has the role of stripping the value from the px characters. It's always doing. And then we're adding slide width, and then we're adding pixels again, so that it's compatible with this left property here. Finally, we're adding an event listener for resize, because when we resize our page, the width of our slides will change because it's responsive. So that means the left values will be rendered useless. We have to calculate new ones. And that's what we're doing here basically, is we're recalculating those left values and the tallest slide. And that's it really. It's a very simple method of creating a slider, and a responsive one at that. It doesn't have any touch-enabled features like when you're on a smartphone and you swipe, it's going to change slide. It doesn't have that. Instead, it just uses these two buttons. Now, our fourth demo will be an image slider. Again, a very popular JavaScript pattern that's being used in a lot of web pages. So we're going to create that in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to lesson number 15, where we'll create a very simple image lightbox. And a lightbox is usually an overlay that shows a much bigger version of a thumbnail, essentially a larger image. So here's the finished result. We're going to do the same thing as the previous. I'm going to show you the finished result. I'm going to show you the code and just walk you through it. So we have a bunch of images here, and when I click one of them, we have this nice transition into a bigger version of that image. And clicking anywhere will actually close that and return us to our original screen. Now, the markup, we basically have a UL with a class of gallery, and each image has its src to a thumbnail, and then data lightbox to the main image. And at the end, we have a div with an ID of lightbox overlay. And this image element will be used to show the main or the bigger image. Now, for the script, and the script is actually very, very simple here. We just have one event listener. Click, and we're listening on the document, anywhere basically. And we're triggering the lightbox click function. So lightbox click gets the element that was clicked on, gets the ID of the element, gets the image that needs to display the larger version, gets the lightbox overlay itself, and it creates a new image. And this is actually another way of listening to click events. So for example, instead of specifying which element we should listen for click events, we're doing document add event listener click. And then inside the function that's triggered, we just filter the results like we do here. So for example, if the element we clicked on has the attribute of data lightbox, that means if we clicked on one of those images, then we know we have to open the overlay. Otherwise, if we click on either the lightbox image, which is the image that's being shown, or the lightbox overlay, then we're gonna close the lightbox, or we're gonna remove the overlay. And inside here, so if we're clicking on one of the images, on one of the thumbnails, we're preventing the default behavior because we are dealing with anchor tags. And then we're creating a new image, and on load, we're setting its src to the src of the image we clicked on. Then we remove the old source from the lightbox image, and we're setting the source of the new image to the source of the image we clicked on. So essentially, when we're doing this bit, we're triggering this function here. And finally, we're showing the lightbox. And that's all there is to it, really. Again, a very, very simple script. Just one event listener, and we're doing two if statements. We're checking, hey, where exactly did you click? Did you click on one of those thumbnails? Fine. It means we need to open a new image. You clicked on anywhere else, you clicked on the lightbox overlay or the lightbox image, fine, that means we have to close the overlay. Very, very simple. Now, the final demo we're going to be looking at shows a very popular element, and that is a tab control. See you on the next lesson. Hi, welcome to lesson number 16, where I'll show you how you can build a very simple tab control. So this is the final result. As you can see, we have 3 tabs, and clicking each one will toggle a different content. Now, the markup is pretty straightforward. We have an UL with a class of tabs that hold the links here on the top. The active one has the class of active. And then we have tab contents, which refer to these right here. Each one has a an ID, tab 1, 2, 3, and so on, and the active one has a class of visible. Very simple. Now, the scripts would do something similar to the previous demo. We're listening to click events on the document, and then we're filtering them. So if we clicked on an element whose href contains tab dash, then we move on. Otherwise, we do nothing. So if the href of the element, basically we get the attribute of the element that has been clicked, if it's not null, and if it has tab dash inside it, then since we're dealing with links, we're going to prevent default behavior. And we check if we didn't click on an active tab, we switch tabs. We remove the active class from all the tabs and all the tab contents, and we simply add it to the element that we just clicked. That's what this line of code here is doing. Now, to actually show the tab content that corresponds to the tab on the top, we get lmhref, and lmhref is basically the href of the element we clicked. So if we click on this first element, the href is tab 1. So we're getting that by ID, and we're going to get to this item. Very, very simple. And we just add the class of visible. So that's how you can create tabs. As you can see, very few lines of code and a very basic principle behind it. That was the final demo for this course. Please join me in the next lesson for the conclusion. Hi, welcome to the conclusion lesson of this course. I really hope you got a better understanding of what you can do with JavaScript as a web designer, right? And more importantly, how to do that. You saw some demos, and those demos represent kind of a very popular elements that you will find, and elements that at some point you might be required to create yourself. Now, you might have downloaded various components like sliders and lightboxes, or maybe you've created some of your own with jQuery. Either way, I encourage you to explore this side a bit further. See the kind of components that you usually use with jQuery. See if you can code them using only vanilla JavaScript, because most of the times we can do that with pretty much everything. With that said, I would like to thank you very much for watching, and from all of us at Tuts Plus, have a nice day.